and I'm going to do a quick, fast explaining video real fast. Our Father in heaven, honor be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on a righteous path and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. 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 All right. So for this demonstration, I'll be using a secondary source to show how you can actually dig deeper in your own private studies or school studies or anything. So that's what I'll be doing today. I'll be showing a quick example of how you can go a little deeper into things by looking at primary sources and secondary sources. So first, let's say if you wanted to learn about something, but you had looked on things like encyclopedias. Now, encyclopedias are interesting tools. Like Wikipedia is a encyclopedia. Now, obviously, this is just more of a collection of information to make it short. But what makes these things very valuable secondary sources is that secondary sources are usually backed with primary sources, but you got to know how to go about it. Sometimes I see some people, they'll mock tools like this and they'll really look over the advantages of time that we have right now for information to keep valuable for generations to come, for truth's sake. Now, in fact, Wikipedia has a lot of very valuable information and a lot of information that and correction. For example, a page on Antioch alone. It has a lot of different information. It goes into the ancient depths. Usually it does a quick summary on this page. It talks about Antioch, gives a quick summary. Now, usually they also have a breakdown of some things like history, geography, things. Now, let's say I wanted to know a little bit about maybe culture of the Hellenistic time frame of Jews during the second century. So my first focus is that I want to find something that's talked about in the second century and isolate those things first. So I'm seeing that right about here, I'm seeing that obviously Christianity during the second century AD would have been widespread in that time. We would have known that that would have had ties with a lot of different areas. But let's say I'm reading here and this is a secondary source. Now, let's also understand what is a secondary source real fast. I think it's important to understand. I'm just going to give a quick summary of what is a secondary source and why secondary sources can be valuable if understood correctly. If understood correctly, I'll just give it right from this little definition. So, secondary sources include books, newspaper reports, reviews of films, etc., and many academic papers. Although this always depends on the context, right? So obviously, it's very transparent. You can see right here, for the purposes of Wikipedia, some publications, including many scientific papers, are, watch what it says, partly a primary source and partly a secondary source. So this is important too because we know sometimes Wikipedia has direct word for word quotes, especially in science. A lot of the science quotes, a lot of the genetic quotes are quotes from the papers and everything. For example, if we go back to Wikipedia, now here we're going to get more of historical reports. And we're going to go into the understanding of these degrees here. But first, let's first stand. Let's say now we see that it says Antioch was a chief center of early Christianity. So we also have to mentally know where Antioch is. Obviously, it's in the area, right? So we would understand when we think about Antioch, this would indeed be an area that would have ties to multiple different cultures and everything, and everything. So Antioch obviously would be in the areas at the edges where we'll think areas of not Spain, Syria. Get that, say that correct. In the corner area, of Syria, right? So that's kind of important. But let's say we want to look at some of these sources here. So let's say an example. Early on, we'll see an example right here. It says in 115 AD, during a certain emperor Trajan. Now, what's also interesting about the wiki pages, you can see that when it has highlighted parts, it's giving you more details of certain topics, which is always interesting and always great, because then you can right click side note, set that aside, because maybe that you may feel like that's a very important person you want to note. I recommend having a note. I recommend having a brand new note. And this is the best way to do research. Erase everything in front of you. Any project that you had before, anything that you had before, set it aside and start the project by the title that you're going to work on. So second, what was that? I'll say second century, or I'll just put second. Leave it as that second, because I'm gonna actually put a lot of things on this note. But let's say I was gonna touch a bunch of things. So let's say I want to touch on things from 200 BC to 280. So, and the reason why, I'll just show why as we do the note. So I'll just put it as second. So everything that I'm focused on is in between these time frames. That's what I want to put on this note. My focus of the note is that I want to put primary sources and secondary sources. But I want the secondary sources to point to the primary sources. So that's going to be the most important thing. So going off of here, one of the most important things that we have to understand is these numbers on Wikipedia or on certain pages of things. What it is a quote from direct sources that are quoting from things that will be quoting from primary sources. So that's going to be very important to point out. But now we also got to go about it carefully, because not everything that is on these are primary sources. So we got to make sure the source is a primary source, or is that source more leading to that primary source, right? So you can see right here, if we was to copy this, right? Because there's a couple different ways to go about it. Some do have a direct link. Like if you was to click it, it would take you to the link and everything. And then you can basically go through basically what it would be. But I like to copy it and everything and go to it, because you can see if I just click it, it depends. Sometimes it'll take you to the source directly. Sometimes, not all the time. So sometimes you can just click it and it'll take you to the direct source. Usually on like if you ever see us go over like genetic information, usually you're going to have direct information to the primary source. It's going to take you right to the primary source. So you see right here, it's trying to take us somewhere. So sometimes the source is not that there is no source, but is that the pathway to that original source link might be broken. That doesn't mean that the source is gone. So that's why I usually do this. I copy it, and what it would allow you to do is go to like actual book and everything, and you can try to go to like what book it is and everything, and find out the information and go to the original book, and then you can go to that page and then see what it's talking about there, and then you'll go and find out that, okay, that would be a historical source telling us information on things that we need to know, on stuff that we need to know. So this would be something else. So you want to make sure, again, if you look for those primary sources, these books, you want to look for those books, the parts of that talks about that goes over those things. And you can see you're gonna have to, with a lot of them, a lot of them, you got to buy actual physical books. And some of them you can get lucky and get the like a digital copy. It's possible, but some of them would not be digital copies. See, this is just the information here. Let us know that indeed this will be basically what historians. So there's some pieces of information by multiple different pieces of information for. So that's something to always know when you go to secondary sources. But I'm gonna go right back here. Now this is more of a way that I would say would be also wise of sourcing these things. Now every link, even if you don't keep the link, put what you search on your note. because you might find some information that might go together perfectly. And what you should do is, maybe if you find you got something that you think won't be there for long, maybe just a lead, because you might find source leads. They might be valuable for your research, but not valuable for the final result, right? It might be valuable for leading up to things. That's why leads also are important. And then evaluating the final result, right? And then what you need for the final result, so for bringing out what you have found, right? Because you don't need to show, like, if someone's digging up something and finding something, they don't need to show what tools they use to dig it out. They don't need to show what color was the tool. They don't need to show what time they dug. Like, that's just extra information that we don't need, even though that all those things matter for how they obtain that information. The same way, like when you search for information, when you're using these don't really matter, but they're how you obtain certain pieces of information. They're one way. There's other ways, but this is an example. But I think there's actually an easy way for maybe individuals that might need to go over something complex. Maybe they had set like a debate out. They got to get studied on some stuff. You got to study someone else's doctrine that you know nothing about or something. And this is a way to kind of get an idea on that and look at the primary and secondary sources, right? So let's let's use something like, let's go to a haplogroup like E1B1B. Go to like genetics. Usually, like stuff like genetics or like human grouping and stuff like that, you'll find more like pinpoint stuff that will be like actual like papers and stuff that will give you like direct primary stuff. And usually the links aren't broken. Usually the links will be not too broken, and you can go directly right to it. So like that. So now it took you right to a paper, and it's giving you a direct primary study, right? Direct study about what they're finding out, right? And so you don't have to look at the secondary source. You don't need the secondary source anymore. You actually can understand the things by looking at the primary sources, because a lot of times also the secondary source may not be completely right. You got to look at the primary sources to verify it. So remember, primary source is the first source, is the most important source. The secondary source is just more of a source that's talking about the first original source. So that's very important to know, that the secondary source has to be in agreement with the first source. So that's one of the biggest things that we got to have understood, is that the primary source is what you want to find, is what you want to get down. But let's say again, you're searching through this history and everything, you know, and you want to learn about maybe Jews in that time. You want to know about the Jews that are living in that time, and how they were living and everything. And maybe you don't know anything about that time. You can go down to about the time of that time and kind of get a good understanding of it, about certain Jewish temples, and you can find out if what's saying is true. And each and every one of them, you can study each and every one of them almost like to your heart content. Now, because the wiki is actually extremely large, it's an extremely large platform, but has a lot of different information on sometimes topics that even scholars never heard of, different scholars of the topic, because what it is different scholars all over coming together and putting together their information and it's examining these things. So it's a bunch of different people that's basically, in a way, putting information together to establish what the primary sources are saying, to put a basic encyclopedia of everything. But let me just jump to, let's say, right, we got Antioch here, and we want to get a little bit of understanding of what's happening with the Jews and everything, and we want to understand what's going on in the Hellenistic age. So sometimes you'll see these titles. There'll be titles on them. So this one just say Hellenistic age, and then you can open it. Usually, like on a phone, you got to open these tabs, but on this is already open, and you'll see. Obviously, you go to the history. You know that the Greeks obviously invaded in the Levanten area, and that's when they got involved with the Jews and everything. And we also got to know that the Jews were invaded already by Nebuchadnezzar, and obviously after that, given to the Persians and the Medes. And that's important because they were speaking the Aramaic script. That's why also we notice on here it also starts to talk about some things that were in Aramaic. It talks about some individuals that were basically mixing together because remember this is still talk about in the areas of Antioch that were dealing with each other. But what I find interesting about it, skipping the just the political things that happen, just gonna scroll down a little bit. You can see you're gonna get some different individuals that be tied to like Edomites and stuff like that. Like this one, this is kind of interesting because this individual in the area of the Jews, you get a lot of stories of Edom that are very important. And this individual, if I scroll down, I actually can point out something interesting about this individual here. Is that he actually will be situated in these areas in Armenia, and then Armenia basically gets some Edomites that starts to dwell in that area, and they're basically from the lines of Herod. So that's kind of interesting when you think about the stories of the biblical text. But that's kind of a different spinoff. That's not what we want to find. We want to find Jews in that second century time, right? But as that can different one of these can lead you down different information. It is, and then someone like, oh, how you know? And then you go and study on that, and you'll find different information that'll start to tie a lot of these together, a lot of those different things together, right? So you can see if we think, right, the Jews, what were they doing? One go about it is doing it like a word search. So let's say we want to find about the Jews. So it talks a little bit about the Jews here. You can see right here, the first one, it says the new city was populated by a mix of local settlers, right? You can see in this little area. So this person that brought is going to be very important in this little area. We're gonna have to, as you see, you can't click it to go to it. You got to copy it, search it. Let's say you didn't know about all those, you got to copy them, search them, find each one of them. But you can see right here, going at the last part, so that the total number of free Greek settlers, including women and children, were probably about such and such amount. And then you can go to like what sources are they using for these things, right? You can click them and see that. Obviously, when going over these things, you want to go over the primary sources. So primary sources will give you more information about these things. So this one will be a JPEG. You need a JPEG, see it, but you can see it's right here of a little bit of the information, talking about some of the things that it was just talking about some of the people settled in the area of Antioch, just going over the population and whatnot. So that's always interesting, a population study. And then you can see here's some other information of some stuff. Maybe you got a direct PDF. Sometimes it's broken, right? Sometimes they're there. It depends on how theirs is set up, how that link is set up. But like I said, if you see these numbers there too, like this one says 12, I can either click it and it brings me down to where these are. And like I said, the best way to do it is just like copy it. So this one just tells you about a public domain. You want to copy the name so it comes from this person here, a Scottish minister, and you just copy it like that. I would say more like that, and then you can search it like that. Copy that, search it, and then find the primary source. And that's the best way of going about it, of understanding how these things, because some people, the reason why I'm doing this because some people think when they see a wiki page they think it's just typed out and there's nothing supporting the material, but there's some things that are typed out on here that there's enough material that supports it. in the primary sources. And that's why when examining these pages, they're very valuable in different ways, but we got to understand what it is that is a secondary source. So that's obviously just a piece of the different dives that this can actually lead into, the different amount of information this could lead to. As you see, it was three different or five different pieces of information about Jews on here, just on Jews of areas of, as you see, Syria. So you can see Jews, just talk about some there. You can see here, latter enlisting a body of Jews, right? And they were dealing with individuals in BC time frame. So it says that Jews were even in that area dealing with different individuals in the BC time frame and the Seleucid time frame. So if I know that this is true, let's say I have a good understanding for a start, because notice how the earlier one up here wouldn't necessarily be a good area to start in a way. It would be more better if I start like maybe closer to like a historical quote or something like that, and that would be more better to get a good understanding of things. So I can get that, and once I understand that, I can look at the primary source. So the primary source is going to go a little bit more into the details, which allows me to also find other sources on it. I can also just look up these individuals and the matter of the event, and there will be other external historical sources on these things that evaluate these things. So that's also one way of going about it. So this is just one source of giving information for this, but there's other sources for finding information on that. I think Wiki is not the best for finding primary sources, but I do think that it does help a lot for like someone wanting to know about maybe someone else's doctrine and information, you know, because someone can go like Google searching stuff and it will lead them on a tunnel, right? They might be looking for like the Aryans, right? Let's say someone says that go and study about the Aryans or something like that, and they're like, "Oh, Aryan, what is Aryan?" They type it down, they think it sounds like Aryan, right? So there's different types of Aryans. There's the old theory of the Aryans, or the groups from a certain area that are basically that part of that whole Indian theory about the replacement of these groups and the Aryans being this new culture that comes there. Or there's the Aryans of the Arius schism of the Aryanites that pretty much were saying that Jesus was not God, which was one of the earliest schisms that was basically voted against in the council, right? So Arian depends, right? It depends. So that's one of those things that when going about these words, if you're typing on Google and stuff, you might get mixed with something different or wrong. And it happens. I see it happen quite often. Um, in fact, I see, like, for example, when people are trying to debunk Christianity, they'll say that Christianity began by the Crusades. The Crusades is what spread the gospel. And they have no idea of the apostolic writings. And if only they had looked at the history, they would know that Christian history begins with the apostolics in the first century, in this first second century, and then obviously you're going to get multiple different pre-Nicene writers before even any creeds. And that's usually what they want to first talk about. Either is the Nicene Creed and thinking everything starts there, and then they might think that things spread because of the Crusades, but that's not true, right? That's a picture that someone wished they can paint, that Christianity rose by crusades, but no, it didn't. Christianity didn't raise by killing people; it raised by martyrs standing for the faith, continuing hospitality, and that's why we still got evidence of that from hospitals, from the origin of hospitals, and different things like that. But this is actually a great way. This way that I'm showing here again is a great way of learning roots of ancient groups. Like, for example, again, let's say someone didn't know about Christians, like early Christianity. You see right there what it says right there. It says the city was also the main center of Hellenistic. So let's just copy this real fast. So obviously Antioch, as still let's talk about Antioch and everything. I'm just gonna copy this whole piece. Let's say this whole piece I want to know about. Let's say I want to know about this whole piece, right? And it says right here, right? It says as a result of his longevity and obviously his role that it played in the emergence of early Christianity, right? When it talks about all these things, the cradle of Christianity and whatnot, it's talking about Antioch. Let's say I didn't understand early Christianity, and I clicked there. I already know that early Christianity, you think of the early Syrian Christians that were there. There were a lot of early Syrian Christians in that area, but a lot of other early Christians there. So right here, you can see it's taking me to a history of early Christianity. Now, one thing you can also notice that Wiki has this nice little block here that usually like gives you like summary of everything. And so this is nice to get a nice summary of what it's talking about. And it counts early Christianity as individuals basically after the book of Acts. So you got your church fathers, how they say church fathers. You have Constantine, you have the council, you have Augustine, you have obviously a bunch of different early writers, but necessarily early church history is actually broken down into a couple different categories. For example, like this one. So you can actually see when they talk about the time of the apostolic see, that's going to be very important for the apostolic seat that was taken during that time, and also earlier events that happened in that time. Much more earlier events that basically happened in the early time of Christianity. But that's what this actually would lead us through the information that would happen in these times. And you can see there's a little bit of Antioch giving us some summaries of some things. And then it'll have some of those secondary and primary sources for telling us what's happening with these things. So that's always important, always interesting to know about. So that's definitely something that I think is important. So you can, like I said, go into Christianity. Now, some of these don't lead. Now, this is the thing also about Wiki. Sometimes if you try to dive like this, sometimes it's hard to dive deeper unless you know certain avenues, certain information. Like if I keep searching and going deeper, I won't know enough until I get to like the first century, second century titles of what those eras are called. Right? That's certain um, groupings of time that have different names. So you can see right here, you can see in the history, we would have a category of early Christianity. So early Christianity has a couple different branches, different ages. So you can see right here, the apostolic age will count for Christianity in the first century and everything. It also kind of counts for the second century. So that's kind of important. You also got your ante-Nicene period. So that's also very, very early. So you can see that's second century stuff up to like third century stuff. So you can see for a nice far pushing out for those between those years. So second, third century necessarily, right? Fourth century at the farthest. This would actually be really important to understand just these two, because Rome doesn't accept Christianity for almost 400 years, almost 400 years, right? Even when it is kind of tries to accept it, it doesn't fully accept it. Like for example, we know that after, let's say, Justinian, we know that then, and that's like a time like around 300-400. That individual basically, he's against Christianity, and he himself is basically trying to, you know, get Rome back to like old idol worship and everything. But then that whole plan falls away, right? Even there's even this episode where they try to build the temple, but that doesn't happen. But this will be very early events, and you can see some of the very important individuals that are notable, how they say that early fathers, right? You can see different individuals of the church, right? This is just early individuals who will be early Christians who died early on. But their letters, you'll start seeing stuff like this, papyrus, right? Now you're starting to get like, of course, primary sources, right? You're getting doubtlessly primary sources. So then you can start looking at papyrus. They'll start telling you names of papyrus, names of different things. So once you start getting to the wiki roots, that's when you start to get into those pinpoint information where it starts dividing that little information that almost will start seeming tedious to go and search it all yourself. But if you get all that information all put together, you can kind of start to put different pieces together. Because a lot of these fragments, a lot of people don't know how early these fragments actually go. And why is it important to know that the amount of letters makes it that much more valuable? Is the amount, the large amount of letters that they have, which makes it very valuable for this history, especially so early for it. And a lot of primary sources can be, basically copied and placed right on your note. And then once all that, let's say you get all the little primary sources and everything, obviously you can go back and just delete what you don't need and keep what you need. And then guess what? Now you got a bunch of primary sources from really deep information because you looked into the secondary sources that led you to those primary sources. So now you had this compact piece of information with primary sources, and that's very key. That's very key because you want to have primary sources. So I'm gonna play a short little video, and is with this. I'm gonna play a short little video of these primary sources and everything. Amen. That's right. That's right. That's right. Be careful where you get your information. That is right. Make sure we also know that. That is absolutely right. That's right. That is right. Amen. The only reason was to unite under one belief system. Constantine was baptized only on his deathbed. Yep. And also remember, Constantine was baptized by Arians. So Constantine was a Roman, but the Christians were not Romans. So the Christians were different people who lived in Rome and Syria and different areas. But Constantine was a Roman. He was not a Christian, but he tolerated them and allowed that meeting to try to avoid a problem that was building up. But after all that, he did get baptized at his deathbed at, by the Arians, by the Arian Christians, and that was not good because the Arians were the ones who actually lost the Nicene Creed vote. But that was just an early one, and after that, Rome still didn't mostly believe. Um, they weren't fully Christians yet. But yes, I'm glad you also said something on that. That's right. That's right. That's right. Not in chronological order necessarily. Yeah, they're letters. So just to summarize, just to understand this. So I wanna play a little video on again why you can use secondary sources to find primary sources and why secondary sources are valuable. Why secondary sources are valuable in their own way. So let me just play a little short little clip of something real fast.
How do historians know about the past? What is a secondary source? Well, secondary sources arise after the period being studied. There are lots of different kinds of secondary sources, partly because historians don't always approach their topics in the same way every time, and partly because secondary source is a very broad category. As an example, let's look at the arrival of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 and the sorts of secondary source material that has been produced about them. There are many specialist books about the history of the Met and how they were formed by the then Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel. Books about criminal justice in general can also offer insights into why the Met was formed. Historians have also written about detailed aspects of the Met's development, such as the history of their uniform and how it's changed over the years. We can also find entries in reference dictionaries and encyclopedias, describing, amongst other things, famous Met cases involving criminals like Dr. Crippen and the Cray twins. The Metropolitan Police have even written up their history from their point of view on their own website. All these, along with hundreds of other books and articles written by journalists, biographers, and amateur authors, are classed as secondary sources too. Historians can use the wide range of secondary source material to answer lots of questions. But writing history is a complicated process. Different authors will have differing views and opinions on the same subject.
All right, so and that's why also how we know the biblical text is a very historical source because there's a lot of these secondary sources speaking of the primary source. That's what makes it interesting when you think about the Christian information is that is a lot of different information, a lot of different eyewitnesses witnessing about one event. That's a real historical factual source, factual event. That's what makes it very interesting with history. That's what makes it that's what makes it interesting in history. Now, again, seeing that primary sources are what we want, but primary sources are going to be the original event. Something looking at the original event, right? There's a couple different ways to get primary sources, right? Obviously, the thing itself is the primary source. So let's say like a stone, like right, a stone that has writings on it, right? A stone with writings on it has like let's say like this right here. This would be a primary source. Like let's say we had this from the third century, and let's say we want to know about Christians in the third century. This would be a primary source of Christians in the third century, right? But it would be a secondary source of Christ. Why would it be a secondary source of Christ? It's a witness about the evidence of historical movements of Christians. But we know Christians were there in the first century, but this would be a third century writing. So it's evidence of it's a secondary source of something that was before it. So that's very interesting with things like that. We also got to know if it's a copy. We got to know if it's a copy. A copy also means that something was before it. So that's always good too. But that's what is good about secondary sources because a secondary source can also be a primary source. So that's very important. So that's why a primary source and a secondary source are actually both valuable. Both of them are very valuable because they give you information in multiple different ways. But the primary source is key. So this will be a primary source. But let's say, like, again, this can also be a secondary source. So primary source, if I want to know about Christians in the like pre-Nicene time frame, it'll be a primary source about those Christians. But if I wanted to know about Christ, this will be a secondary source about Christ. So it'll be giving me some information about Christ because Christ Himself would be a source. So that's one of the biggest things. Like genetics, your blood is a source. So like in genetics, the original blood, the drop of the blood is where they're getting the information from. That's what holds the information. Is the blood has the information. Remember, DNA is actually a language. It holds information. So we know that that's a true thing when we think about in genetics. So when you click on these sources, it takes you to actually secondary about the primary source, which is blood. But necessarily, this will be considered a primary source because it will be the primary source of the information from the blood, but the direct source, the direct object of the source is the primary source. That's really the primary source, especially when it comes to blood, right? Not with everything is like that, but blood is like that because blood is a language. So it actually has a code in it. So that's very, very important. But like history, like the papers, the stones, and all those things, those are again primary sources in themselves because a lot of times they have writings and stuff like that. But we need someone that goes and evaluate those things and maybe write up a report of those things. And sometimes that's taken as a primary source. So it can be a secondary source if someone's reviewing after it and they're giving you a report of it. But if they're giving you like pinpoint exactly, like for example, let's look at something that would be technically still part of a primary source. Let's say, mm, or let's go to the Silver Scrolls. Yeah, let's go to the Silver Scrolls right here. So in the Silver Scrolls, which were some old scrolls with Hebrew text, there were some very old scrolls with Hebrew text on them that people know as the Silver Scrolls. And these scrolls were found about 600 BC during the time when the temple was still there, the first temple. And this would have been a scroll during the time when the Israelites were there, as it says, during the first temple and everything. But there is a translation from it. Now, would the translation be a primary source or a secondary source? The translation would actually be a primary source because the translation is translating what's directly from it. So the translation, if 100% true, can't be changed because that's what the source is saying. Though it is a later though we're translating it later. So some will bend and try to say that they're the secondary source because there's a person that's translating later, giving us information later. But if the interpretation is correct, and that's exactly what it is, and almost every person is unanimously agreeing with it, and usually they'll completely agree with it if that's literally how it'll scholarly go, like linguistically or in the method, and there's no like debating. Then usually if there's a full agreement, then that's from the primary source itself. That the primary source is saying that, not someone just coming with an interpretation of the source. But this right here, you can see right here, this will actually be a translation of the script. So remember, also in ancient times or ancient things, it's important to know about, text versus script. Script, text versus language, how you speak it or how you say it, all those different things around it, you know, slang and all that. That's gonna be different. But this is gonna be like Hebrew, old Hebrew. So it's still Hebrew. So Hebrew is Hebrew, but there's like Paleo Hebrew, there's your Neo and all that stuff like that. Later Hebrew, the Aramaic mixed in Hebrew and all that, block Hebrew and all that. But there is going to be an understanding here that on this scroll it does talk about the Most High, and it says His name and everything. So it's a perfect alignment for the Israelites, obviously being at the Second Temple, right? And that they're Hebrews, which is really interesting stuff. But this would be this would be obviously a primary. This would be seen as a primary source, right? So how do we know that this is a right translation that is doing on this thing? Now we can check the primary source and get the information ourselves, because if I go to this, I can most likely find a lot. It's most likely going to take me to a library or a I'm gonna go back. It's either going to take me to a library or some type of college, usually, for the information. If not, these type of finds or certain type of finds like that is usually easy to find. So here's right here. You can see where they talk about. They talk about the earliest biblical texts, and obviously this is some scholars looking at it and going over it. So that's giving us some information of it. But I think usually on these ones, they usually have a link to where that translation came from. And this one, I already know where they got it. It's most likely the little library, British Library, where it is actually most likely coming from. If not, one of those little areas. But as you can see, there's a lot of different information around it to give the breakdown. I myself would type, Silver Scrolls, maybe like translation and everything and all that, direct translation and all that. And that would be more for that. So like stuff like direct information like this, you might not need to use like those wiki things like that. But they can provide more information to some things that you may not know about. But you can also again type it down and do it yourself, and that's another way of going about it. But this is just showing how to go about finding extra information using secondary sources and how you can get a little deeper into the information. So if you have any questions, I want to stay for an hour. I'm gonna stay for about an hour and just go over a little more. That's right. That's why they are trying to do DNA tests on everyone. A lot of symbols have been translated wrong. Look at what Sam's side. Kill. Yep. Yep. I like those two stars. I'll just leave those right there. So you can see, if you go into these things, you can go into a little more and stuff. I'm sure there's like more direct pinpoint sources on these things and everything, and you can go directly into like the scholars that translate them, how they translate them, and all those different things, all about that, and even to the history. This one, a lot of people already know about it, so that's more of like going into the information, know about it, jumping on wiki, and then looking on how to go about it. Sometimes wiki doesn't give you a lot of information on some topics, but some topics it does give you a lot of information. One of the most valuable pieces of information that I think wiki is great for is for like ancient cultures, for like ancient cultures. Like let's say like Natufian, right? So like Natufian obviously would be an ancient culture, right? But let's say I want to know who's before Natufian, because some people think Natufian is the start of all cultures in the Levant. But I say no, I want to see who's older than it. On this first little page right here, it'll have this little box, and it'll have right here. You'll see the major sites where that group is at. Right, you got the time frame that is at. You got the dates, and remember, this is again the secondary source, so it depends on the sources that we have. So it's going to be limited to the primary sources that it has available. So there's always going to be more information for these things. This is more like a summary. But you can go to right here where it says precede by or followed by. So followed by means later on, like what descends from it, or what comes later, or what will come and replace that culture later. So that would be interesting. But let's say I want to go older and check what's older before it. I can go deeper and check what's older before it. So this is a Coperan culture. I can see how older that one is. And maybe I want to go a little older. So proceed by, I can go a little more older. So this one seems a little more older, but I want to go a little older. I can go deeper. So there's couple different ways to go, a couple different cultures to go deeper. This one is fairly deep. Let's say I want to go a little older. I want to know like older cultures there and whatnot. To still go back, proceed by. Here's an older culture. So I can know a little bit about the older ones. And now it's starting to talk about like Neanderthals and stuff. But and some places, few people know that also modern men are still in a lot of these areas. So modern men and Neanderthals are still like ancient back then and whatnot. And then sometimes checking the genetics can be really interesting as well, and some things of it and about those cultures. So it's always interesting of doing that. And you can go to other different cultures, some things that obviously some people may have never heard about some of these cultures, but they'll take you back into different ancient cultures and ancient times, going really far, really really far back. And you could say, well, how far does it go, how actual far does it go? And sometimes like this type of information, it's really interesting to go over. So you can go over different pieces of information. But obviously, me, I'm sticking towards like biblical studies and even understanding it by either a young Earth or old Earth method. And both to me seems to have its own win-win in a type of way. in a type of way, in his own type of way, right? So this is actually one of those things I say again, looking at the information carefully, you can go really deep into the information. You can go really, really, really deep into basically the information of what these things are showing here. But you just gotta know that this is a encyclopedia, right? It doesn't hide what it is, but it does tell you what exactly it is. That is a encyclopedia. That is a pretty much a whole bunch of articles and entries of information put together so that people later on, existing even thousands of years now from now, if so be, they can still know about the agreed information that was known early on. So agreed factual information that's known early on, instead of just us being taught stuff. And the only way we can learn the stuff is if we go to schools and we have to pay someone to tell about the stuff, which is always one way of going about it. But you can also educate yourself by studying the stuff yourself. Maybe getting a private tutor, because there actually is a lot of private tutors nowadays that are available, and some that are affordable. So it's a lot of different things that people can do nowadays to find more information. Some even teach you. There's professional scholars, linguists, Egyptologists, historians of different types that are talking freely, giving us right now free education, free information that we can verify and recheck and prove and hold for ourselves because it's valuable forever, pretty much. So factual information is always valuable, right? It's not like a joke. A joke is funny, you laugh, it gave you a spark and everything. Now it's done. You forget it. Don't remember it, because don't go around and say that it was true, right? A lot of memes and stuff, a lot of stuff like that, and people are going around saying stuff is true, right? That's why I think certain things like TikTok and certain shorts are dangerous. But that's just me. But that's how you use secondary sources. So again, I'll do a quick summary real fast on how you would use one if you was a search for something. So let's say you had a project, right? Let's say you wanted to know about something, right? Let's say you want to know about second century Jews. Second century Jews, and usually you'll see one for a wiki. Let's say right here, right there, history of Jews in the Roman Empire. This is great. This is actually I used yesterday, right there. That's a Jew from the second century. He has actually a really interesting story to him. Maybe I should go over one day. But if you never heard of this Jew story, it's a very interesting one. But this is actually an interesting little thing, because it goes over all the information of Jews. Now, let's say I want to keep this, right? I'm gonna copy it, add it to my note, make sure it's in the time frame that I want it at. I gotta look at the time frame for this one, right? Go back to that. So right here, what's the time frame? It's about here. So I'm gonna note the total of the time, right? I'm gonna put the total of the time. So it's gonna give me these in between time frames. So I know it's gonna be at the end of this. So I'm gonna put a space because it's gonna be my ender. The beginning and the end on your note, and fill it in between all the details that you need to fill in between. That's what you're gonna add in between these. So put your start and your end. That's the best way of research, I would say, is have a start and an end. Know where you're going to start and know where you're going to end. And that way, the amount of information that you can provide to that subject can be concentrated on that time frame, because the amount of information you can actually get for that time frame academically is actually very detailed, very, very detailed. Things can get very, very detailed. So now that I have this at the end, I'm going from, as we see right here, some of the Jews dealing with Greeks. So these are Greeks all the way dealing with Romans. So dealing with Romans later on. So from this time frame to this time frame, I know Jews are dealing with what? Greeks to Romans. So if I just wanted to make a report of 200 BC to 280 and everything's just the second century, then I would necessarily write about the Jews dealing with Greeks until the Jews deal with Romans. And I want to provide detailed sources. So I want to go over the primary sources and talk about the primary sources. Now, that's what people usually want to see. They want to see the primary sources. And you can always go about these things and point it out with the secondary sources and explaining how those things work in the secondary sources. But not everyone can understand that how a secondary source works, and they'll think that there's not enough in that secondary source for them to believe it. But the amount of information that's placed on just the front page or the pages of the histories on these things makes you realize that even if you was to search it, you'll realize that these names can't be just made up. Like Wiki's not just typing out made up names, and these are not really actual historical people. Just knowing that these are historical people makes this page that much richer. Right? Now of course there's dozens of pages out there, dozens. But this is just a way to use one of the common encyclopedias, and I think actually has a lot of worth in a way, in his own way, right? In his own way. So I would say that this will be the proper way, or one of the proper ways of going about secondary sources. Note those primary sources, which are the numbers. So you can note right here, usually these little numbers right here, and then it'll take you to whatever it is. So let's say one of these I wanted to go to, like let's say this one. And sometimes you'll have a link, like maybe this one right here, and it'll take me to the link. So was there a Roman charter for the Jews? And that's going to give me some information about Rome being connected with the Jews, a couple different things that they did during that time. So as we go right here, Jews on one hand and the Greeks and the natives on the other were often profoundly hostile to one another. So now I know that this is going to tell me about history of pinpoint understanding of Jews that were dealing with Rome and basically getting hostile to each other and whatnot, and a couple different things. So it's going to give me different highlights about the primary source and everything. So, and then what can I do? What can I do when I got this source right here? I can either buy it. I can either there's ways of getting the book free. There's different ways of going about it. I can put it right here. Right, I can put it right here, and I can copy some text from it and everything. Let's say this. Also, in these notes, when you do these things, you want to give yourself prompts like maybe go to the one or go to this thing or that thing, and all those are fine. So now that that's done, I don't really need this source anymore. And now if I really wanted to, I can get rid of all my secondary sources, and now all I would have is primary sources on my note. And with primary sources, it will look more clean on a note than having a bunch of wiki sites. Now, like I said, you can have some wikis on it, and that's fine. But primary sources are gonna give more of that clean polish, that real hit of information when someone receives it. So, but that's the best way of getting primary sources, I would say, for that method for using secondary sources. But with that, family, that's all I got for now. But if anyone has any questions, let me know. That's all I got. So all we did was talk about how to use a encyclopedia or a secondary source simply, right? This gets more deeper and complex on how to use it. But this is the most simple way of going about it, is going to the encyclopedia, reading through it, finding the numbers where they have the sources, find those sources. So find a number and find a source, copy the source, and find the book, or find that source of it. Find the book of it, or click it if it has a hyperlink or anything, and find the source of it. Take the source, go to the direct source, and evaluate the information. Most likely, what I would do is buy the book. or get the book, because usually sometimes they're free, or however it is for you to log in or register in it. And once you do that, once you get access to it, you can then go through the citations of it and get the information of it. And then you can basically put those all quoted on the thing. Once all those are all quoted, then you have your primary sources. You have your primary sources. So you want to get deeper into those primary sources, find out what they are talking about, because this will also lead you to like what they're quoting from. So it might lead you to like old manuscripts, old stones, old things like that. Because usually when the historians usually are talking, other individual talking, they're quoting primary sources. So they're going to be quoting what this source says or what this um, event shows, and so that's going to be basically important to understand for that, for putting those pieces of information together. That primary sources are what you want, but secondary sources still have value. But that's all I got for now, family. May you be blessed. May you be beloved. And amen, family.